Just off the Azores, the little aircraft carrier Invincible tranquil as a toy in a bathtub. A pocket-sized, portable, floating airfield. Half fish, half bird. Aviation for the connoisseur. If you pay income tax, it costs you £6 out of your pocket. Dispensing with overseas bases and long-range jets. Alone or in a battlefield. A repertoire for all tastes, from Soviet submarine hunting to Third World gunboat diplomacy and the whole range in between. The full works, aircrew.
Alpha 2, roger.
Controllers.
North 4307, 0.
Mariners.
Yes, please.
Jets. Runway. Radar. Ground crew. Helicopters. Spares and maintenance. Do we see ourselves still needing to do all this? In our size, our economic state, in the world as it's changed?
Hey, green deck fixed wing.
Our three carriers got reprieved in the last defence cuts, and in peace dividend arguments that decision has not been seriously questioned. Now, having made this choice, is Invincible effective? This is an oddball of an aircraft carrier, a hybrid, a poor man's carrier. Not originally meant to be a carrier at all, but a large cruiser with a bit of flat deck for some helicopters and a couple of holes cut in it so that they could be stored and serviced and armed under cover. So there is no angle deck with its steam catapults. There are no arrestor wires and nets and what's it to stop the jets teetering off the end into the sea again. There's no room for any of these. It is a tiny ship. You could fit 5 of these into one of the big American carriers. But if you take a Harrier fighter with its swiveling jets and its ability to take off in a very short space, and then you cant up one end of the deck into a sort of ski jump, you have gotten yourself a miniature aircraft carrier, and that is Invincible. But miniature aircraft carrier it may be, but it is the biggest ship afloat to be powered exclusively by gas turbine engines. Those are modified Concorde engines. It's the biggest ship with girls on board. It's the biggest ship in the British Navy. And it's got one of the first captains in the Navy to be computer literate. It's one of the few ships to have fought at sea, really fought, in the Falklands, since World War II 50 years ago. It's the product of ingenious compromise. But how well does it work? Start with the runway, the airfield, the ship. Yes, it floats. That means it can be sunk. It mustn't. Down the iron ladders just above the bilges where the twin rudders run, where few of the crew ever come. Here is part of its survival kit. Those rudders can spin the ship on a dime. Do you see that bend in the wake? Invincible can turn full circle in 4 or 5 minutes. None of that old supertanker nonsense about needing 2 miles. It's the difference between a torpedo hitting the middle, where the tender machinery in the operations room are, or hitting the nose or the backside that can take a lot of punishment. Gears are the crucial component, here in the middle of the ship. Biggest reversible gearbox in any Western Navy. Put that out of action and Invincible would be helpless. Slam the gears into reverse and they will stop the ship motoring flat out at its full 30 knots, 35 miles an hour. And stop it in 3 times its own length. The effect, if you were shooting at a fast-flying duck or a grouse or a jet, and they were able to stop in 3 times their own length, you'd miss. So Invincible could well dodge a torpedo. But converting the ship, when it switched from helicopters only to helicopters plus jets, makes it far from perfect. How big a nuisance is it to have those great big holes cut in the deck?
They're actually in the wrong place. If we were designing this deck afresh for fixed-wing aircraft operations, I think we'd put the holes on the side. In other words, we would go for side lifts, which we have used in some of our carriers in the past. But that would mean that the runway was then not interrupted by the lifts when there's a need to move an aircraft up or down to the hangar. We manage our way round it quite satisfactorily, but given the opportunity to redesign, a side lift would be the preferred answer.
Still, it's a sturdy, nimble little ship with a lot of clever engineering. But how well is it handled? This is about as far from ordinary seamanship as it is from a rowboat on the Serpentine. Even something as routine as refueling at sea, floating, let's suppose, off an unfriendly shore. Not just difficult, dangerous, not something the captain would delegate.
As you can see, the tanker is a mile ahead of us at the moment, and we're moving up into what we call the waiting station, which is 300 to 500 yards astern of her. The difficulty with the maneuver, we need to move into a position where we're about 150 feet on her beam, but a ship moving through the water creates zones of pressure and suction around her, and we need to ensure that we move through the zone of interaction where those pressures fail to balance out.
Now tell me that in English.
Right. As the ship moves through the water, she has zones around her created by her passage through the water of pressure and suction. Around the bow of the ship there's a pressure zone, then there's a zone of reduced pressure, a beam of the ship, and a further pressure zone astern. Excuse me.
I'm preparing to receive us alongside.
Very good. As long as we are in balance with those zones, then we can safely maneuver alongside her. As we close each other, the zones tend to interact and can tend to throw the ship off course. So what we aim to do is to move up from that waiting station with a high overtaking speed to move through the zone of interaction into a position where we're stably alongside her at the same speed as quickly as we can.
Are you saying that it's clumsy or that it's dangerous?
I'm saying that it's potentially dangerous because the forces there are extremely great, and we need to ensure that we have enough rudder movement left to control the ship as we move through those zones. Inherently, it's dangerous, but of course we practice this frequently, and I hope you'll be able to see that we're able to do it safely.
050.
Very good. Stop both engines.
Stop both engines. Both of us are pretty stops.
Revolution 78.
Revolution 78.
Firing a line across to the tanker. Didn't make it the first time. Sea calm as a mill pond. Ships almost touching. Men and girls hauling the pipe on board. Side by side with the rhythm as old as the sea itself. A lot of manhandling. Methods old as Noah's Ark, because a war-damaged ship might need to be sailed as Noah sailed it. I bet in a real emergency they can hang sails off the radio and the radar masts. They still use flags to signal during a radio silence. Fuel pipe coming on board now. Pumping at the rate of 2 petrol tankers every 2 minutes. Invincible does 10 yards to the gallon. Were Invincible a full-blown carrier, it would dwarf that supply ship. It's only a fifth the size of the American Mastodons with their 100 jets on board. But no call to apologize for the skill, the competence of the crew. You need certain basic skills to sail a ship, and you need certain basic skills to fly a jet. But to fly a jet off a ship, you need more than basic skill. The pilot on a carrier has to deal with a runway that could be 30 miles away from where he left it when he took off, sailing a zigzag course. May not have told him because it's keeping radio and radar silence, showing no lights to avoid detection. And when he finds it, if he finds it, The deck will be 60 feet above the water, which makes visual reference difficult. It will be bucking and pitching and rolling capriciously, erratically. The strain is enormous, unnatural. The Navy knows it. And the men who train the Navy pilots know it. And the pilots themselves know it, but they have a tongue-in-cheek perversity about saying so. It often seems to me that it takes a sadist to have thought up the idea of landing a jet on the deck of an aircraft carrier which has moved several miles away from where it was when you first left it. How do you find your way back?
How do we find a way back? It really is straightforward. You know the launch position, you know where the ship's, the mean line of advance, you know the recovery position. And as long as they stick pretty roughly to that, then it's absolutely straightforward. The navigation system can predict the position of the ship. You've got a radar to find the ship. You've got the ship's radars, if needs be, to get yourself back to the ship. It's a non-event, it really is. And in some ways, it's easier than finding an airfield, because it's there and it's unmistakable. In poor weather, finding an airfield can sometimes be difficult, because it blends in with the background, for example. Well, the ship never does that. You know it's an aircraft carrier, you know it's there bobbing up and down, it's unmistakable. So it really isn't a problem.
But in wartime, when you're having radio silence,
Right.
and it is maneuvering.
Right. Well, that's when the problems come, when the ship is radio and radar silent, when you're required to be radio and radar silent within a given range, and you don't have any other aids to get back. It's a cross between mental DR and using the inertial kit in the aeroplane to come back to a rough position and hope to find the ship. You always reserve the right, of course, that when the fuel's getting low and you really don't know where the ship is, all those rules go out of the window for aircraft safety, even in a war. But we managed in the Falklands without any instances, I think, without any instances at all, to get back to the ship in completely radio and radar out during the daylight hours. And there were no problems.
When the helicopters patrolled for as long as 6 hours without a break, Invincible could have covered a couple of 100 miles. Look, supposing there was a real shooting war, and you go out and you detect a submarine. You send signals back to Invincible. There's submarine, the area. Invincible then changes course very fast indeed to get the hell out. And because there's radio silence, doesn't tell you that it isn't where you left it. How do you get home?
Well, there are going to be some problems with that. We rely very heavily...
I like you calling them some problem. Seems to me an enormous problem.
Hopefully not, because we spend a great deal of care and attention in our briefing procedures and in our means of knowing what people are going to be doing, and if they're unable to do it, alternative plans. It may be that, in fact, were Invincible required to go at very short notice, fast, a long distance away from us, then indeed we would have to go and land on another vessel, perhaps a Royal Fleet Auxiliary, or indeed one of the Type 22 frigates that might be operating with us. So we would plan the contingencies to make sure that if it really was not essential, or it was essential rather, to send Invincible away at that sort of short notice, that we would have alternatives up our sleeve, as it were, to ensure that we weren't a wasted asset and unable to get home. It might be true that in the real heat of war, the command may have to make a decision that an aeroplane is less important than some other particular task that has to be done, and that would indeed be one of the more difficult but often essential command decisions made at sea.
So in the worst case, you would be expendable?
I don't think expendable. I think if one is expendable, one would feel there was no way that one would recover or survive. Certainly the aeroplane would have to land on the sea if it couldn't find anywhere else to go, but we would then hope that in a later stage rescue operations would be conducted, and we carry a great deal of equipment to assist people in relocating us. But I would personally feel that would be a very extreme situation.
But it's landing at night that really separates the men from the boys.
Well, again, that concentrates the mind a little, just because of the lack of visual references. And all you've got is a couple of lights, a centerline light and a glide path indication. And of course they tend to go awry if the ship's rolling a lot, rolling or pitching a lot.
What makes you take on the sort of extra misery of flying for the Navy?
Extra enjoyment, extra satisfaction. There's no misery at all. Not
Now
at
come,
all.
you could have had a lovely time in the RAF. Nice fixed airfields, diversionary airfields, all these things laid out on a map, instead of hunting for a little carrier in the middle of the sea.
I'd have been bored, I think.
Would you?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Not every good pilot's got the right temperament. Often take the strain. Not just the strain of flying from a drunken rolling runway, but the strain of a weapon and a radar system that would normally be the work of 2 men in a 2-seat jet. Invincible's deck can't take the extra weight. They're precious, these Harrier pilots. Cost the Navy £4,287,000 to train, and leave all too rapidly for richer, quieter lives with the airlines.
I've grown since I wore that last.
Helicopter pilots have different pressure. Long, wearing 6-hour patrols, policing the seas for submarines. Off they set for work like businessmen carrying their briefcases. Their takeoffs and landings every bit as hazardous as a Harrier's.
6 hours up there isn't easy. When you come down, you're totally, you're drained, full stop. Your brain, your body is drained.
What we do is you get airborne for 5 hours and you're there constantly. From, I'd say, an hour and a half before you take off, you brief, yeah? From that time onwards until you land on, an hour after, that's about nine hours at a time. You're there, you're mentally stressed and that, because of the fact you're flying and that all the time. And your workload is at the limit. And you come down, you are shattered.
You come down, you
You've
debrief.
eight to 10 hours off, and then you're up
You're
again,
up again.
starting again.
You
It's just
debrief,
a
you get something to
continuous-
eat, and away you go again, you get a shake, right, briefing so-and-so. Same briefs, up you go again, do the same,
If you've got an exercise now for about, say, 6 weeks, and that's all we have, it's constant 6 weeks of hard work, non-stop. And at the end of the 6 weeks, you are really shattered, you are worn down.
You're either sleeping, flying, or eating. That's all you do for the whole 24-hour period. You actually lose track completely of time.
Right through the ship, relentless pressure. Not just aircrew, everyone. 24 hours a day for the 2, 3, 4 months that they're at sea. It's a less comfortable, more restless ship, since the Navy found it could cram Harriers and more helicopters on board. Crew size near doubled. It's very tight, isn't it?
Very tight.
Yes. Which is yours?
Mine's the top bunk at the back there. You get used to it. It's not too bad in a mess this size. The only problems we really have is, if you can see on the right there, is that the actual lockers are right next to the beds. When you've got 6 guys that have got out at the same time into the lockers, and we start climbing over the top of each other and trying to get past and get out. That's the only problem we have, really.
Twice the mouths to feed in less space and less time.
Dining hall can seat 98, and yet we've got 700 junior rates we've got to eat here. And as a result, every chair you see has got to have a bottom on it 6 times each meal time. Now this is to do with the additional people that we take because of our enhanced air group, and that an area of the junior rates dining hall was taken for an operations room some years ago. So unfortunately, these people here can't really sit down and linger over their meal and have a cigarette. Well, not that we allow smoking anyway, of course, but they can't sit and linger. It's come in, eat a meal and out, and that's just the harsh reality of the small space available for them.
Yes. On this trip, the pressure exacerbated by a special crisis. They complain you're all very conservative, and there's enormous consumption of baked beans.
Not the American baked beans, there isn't. They're lions.
What's wrong with them?
American ones. I don't know, they're just different to ours.
We have a real problem with baked beans at the moment because we can only take so many, of course, to store in size, which incidentally is, again, only scaled for just over 700 people. We had to take American baked beans, and Americans don't like baked beans the way we like them. And at the moment, the boys are not very happy about their barbecue beans.
A fire exercise, more pressure, sudden, unrehearsed. Hard experience of air attack has left an abiding terror of fire on board. Fire and flash and burns that Invincible saw in the Falklands when Sheffield, Galahad and Atlantic Conveyor and the men on board them burnt. Partly culpable, the Ministry of Defence. In one of its look how we save money moods, it bought standard, off-the-shelf, unprotected industrial cables and parts because they were cheap. Every member of the crew is fire-trained, goes into the smoke.
Sally, you watch his head. Get it a bit nearer there. Right, hands on, please. Are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Right, 2 seats.
Fear of burns has shaped the daily routine. No bare arms on deck with aircraft. No nylon. Discipline, discipline, nag, nag.
There are always pressures on the ship. There are pressures to fly, to maintain currency. There are pressures to train in all the various facets of our operations. And we can't train all the time. We also have to maintain, and maintenance takes a lot of our time, planned maintenance, routine maintenance, and defect repair. And then alongside that, of course, we have to give people the opportunity to have some time off.
You'd be blind not to be impressed by the concentration, the discipline of crew under pressure and by trip's end deeply, deeply tired. Chances to release the tension are few and precious. Save a rare hour or so, the aircraft and their acolytes monopolize the deck. The rest live like troglodytes below ground, in perpetual artificial light, within steel walls that echo and reverberate incessantly.
Twist the body and stretch down!
That voice of command is the voice of the Chief Wren. And this must be one of the biggest management changes the ship has had to face.
Left leg over right this time, damn it!
Long tours of duty, difficult work, cramped conditions. These are an inevitable part of life on a miniature aircraft carrier. Then last year, something fresh to cope with. Girls. Aircrew apart, doing the same jobs as men. Working alongside them, professional, completely integrated. What had they expected? Girly jobs?
No, because I was already an air engineer mechanic.
Yes.
And I joined up as that, so we knew we'd stay in the same trade. We'd just basically be doing the same job at sea as we were doing shoreside.
I'm an air engineering mechanic, and I did motor mechanics at school, so it comes from there. I didn't want to go on a YTS, so I looked at the services and they showed me air engineering, which I jumped into.
But what happens in their time off? And that's not an entirely prurient question. Navies again sex on board because it wouldn't stop at mere sex. Let in jealousy, heartbreak, and it becomes hard to run an efficient ship. Have you had any difficulties?
There have been very few, remarkably few. I think it would have been naive to expect that there would have been no problems. Those that there have been very minor and usually inflated out of all proportion by the cheaper tabloids.
Personally, for myself, I'm engaged. I've got a beautiful fiancée at home. I'm not interested in anything that's on board at all, to be honest. My girlfriend owns far better looking than anyone on board here anyway.
How did the lads look at you when you turned up?
They were all giving it that 10 to begin with.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it?
She deserves 2 or whatever. But they had their, I think they were afraid to begin with that we'd do a better job than them.
They're so well integrated now that you really don't notice whether you're working with a male or female. You know, you're all alongside each other and to do a job and you get on.
Do you ever notice any girls who have a naughty twinkle in their eye?
Well, if they do, I don't notice them.
Turn a blind eye.
Well, I'm happily married anyway, so I wouldn't be looking.
I think it took them a while before we could get accepted. But they've settled down a lot now, and well, they look at us like sisters now. So,
Only sisters?
Well, yes, you know.
Well, the potential obviously is there for things to happen, but there haven't been any really recorded incidents, especially amongst the ratings. There's no problem. People just get on together.
When you're looking at it over the long term, when the girls are no longer a curiosity, and you've got a much higher proportion of them on board, do you think that it'll be time to modify these very strict rules about no sex?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think that sex has any place on board a warship. It introduces other emotions such as jealousy, and I think you've seen from your time here, we're very dependent upon each other, and we have to remain dependent upon each other, and therefore I don't believe that there is room for any change in those rules. We're looking really at a code of conduct here, not a whole lot of rules.
Hard to believe the sea can cool normal passions so totally. But I saw no evidence to the contrary. A ship is not a private place, except for officers who've been the majority of the few caught in flagrante throughout the Navy as a whole.
Oh, nightmare.
Have girls changed the ship?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the waves of scent tell you when you're near their quarters. They've done wonders for the laundry. The Chinese laundry that sails privately, entirely unofficially with the British Navy. Laundry charges now include silk shirts and fluffy sweaters. It's a 7-day slog, plus on Sunday, prayers. Have the girls proved a point about the management of the ship that has integrated them with barely a backward glance? Without question. This complex community contains all the problems facing a modern manager, holding the reins between tradition and innovation with 2 crews, cultures, technologies, sexes, enclosed in a self-sufficient hermetic bubble. A case study to rank beside the best of the business schools. But what about the aircraft, its cutting edge? That is another matter. All the years that I've seen it, and I still want to cheer every time I see a skilled pilot put a Harrier through its paces. Flying backwards and sideways and revolving like a controlled mechanical ballerina. There is no other aircraft in the world that can do this. And it's not for want of trying. Harrier is special, unique, entirely British. But this is a warship, not a circus. The 8 Harriers are its teeth, and a dozen or so helicopters are its claws. And this is their go-anywhere airfield with 1,200 people dedicated entirely to keeping those aircraft sweet and flying. So how are they making out? You've got to think what they're for. It came out of the morning mist, a full-blown Soviet spy ship, antenna all a-quiver. It came to within a few hundred yards of Invincible. This is why Invincible was built, for the Soviet threat. Easy to think the threat has gone, but that navy, whoever ends up controlling it, is still being modernized. Still launching 9-10 submarines a year. Still defence's biggest strategic worry, however befogged the politics. And I suppose that thinking's right.
The Soviet threat, I prefer to refer to as a military capability, is of course very largely still intact. And I think I would agree that the will to use it perhaps has declined, and we might well have more warning of any threat that would be posed from that direction. But there's still a potent military machine there, and I don't believe we can afford to ignore it. And so we still continue to practice against the Soviet threat, largely in our exercises, because it is probably the most difficult to counter.
And what about other parts of the world?
There's a widespread military capability in other parts of the world, and I think perhaps I can highlight it by just mentioning that there are well over 200 submarines outside the Warsaw Pact. So it would be foolish to dismantle anti-submarine capability because we no longer believe that the Soviet threat is poised against us.
So we go a-hunting, hunting submarines in a heavy, rugged old warhorse of a Sea King helicopter that the Navy's been using for 20 years in various forms and won't replace for a good few more yet. Yet this is Invincible's main purpose. Keeping track of some of the 300 operating Soviet submarines, the 200 others owned by assorted governments both respectable and rogue. Hardly a country with a coastline without one or two. North Korea has 22, Libya 12, Brazil has 5. Is it ageism on my part to criticize honest old Sea King? All it has to do, after all, is to ferry various listening devices. Some trailed on the end of a string, some dropped in formal patterns overboard. Well, age does matter. Try servicing a helicopter built to the engineering of the 50s.
Now. 83's gone. Next one is 52 as briefed.
A new Merlin helicopter has at last been ordered.
Well, the Merlin, of course, is going to be a huge advance over the Sea King. I think the Sea King has grown in weight by 50% since it first entered service. So its deck operating envelope, the wind conditions that are required, are fairly constraining in order to get a very heavily loaded Sea King off the deck. The Merlin will be much more agile. It'll have a much better performance from the deck, and therefore it will be less demanding to operate. And, of course, in terms of its military capability, it will be a step forward over the Sea King.
Delivery will only be 20 years after the Navy first asked for it. Starting 95, and you know how defence orders slip. By which time the Navy's biggest ship, its outward symbol of air power, will have been carrying out its key role with a design 40 years old, and that does matter.
Captain Zawo just received indications from shore of raid closing from the Wesser. Like to go to air threat warning red and bring the ship to action stations up? Yes, please.
It's not just the anti-submarine job. Same helicopters used for the indispensable early warning radar. Inside those bloated udders alongside. Going after some French jets making a practice attack. And there was, or is, North Sea oil pipe holding on the radar. Lashed up in 6 weeks when men were dying and ships were burning in the Falklands for want of radar warning. Magnificent then, but now, that radar still hanging there like a cow's udder, bolted on, exposed, vulnerable, as Invincible's first line of defence. Have we lost all sense of urgency?
Well, I don't think you could say lack of urgency. I mean, in many ways, the success of the helicopter that we introduced in the days of the Falklands, which is the one that you see now on board, is an indication of anything but a lack of urgency. You call it a lash-up. It's a little bit more of a structured aircraft than that, and has been highly successful. Clearly, we are aware of shortcomings when one looks at the equipment that we now have and the technology that we now have, we would like to see an uprated version of what we have.
But they're not going to get it. The radar still hangs exposed, defenseless. They'll still go on tucking it up before they land, like an old lady tucking hair under her hat.
All positions in the ops room, on anti-flash, on anti-flash.
What it's like to be an air base under attack.
This is the AWO, SITREP. Further indications from shore indicate aircraft closing from the west. Therefore, hands to action stations, hands to action stations. Assume MBCD, state 1, condition Zulu. On anti-flash. All positions AWO, SITREP. We have the Super-Etendard aircraft closing from the west, threat axis 270, believed to be strength 1, armed with Exocet missiles. Zippo 4 is in port.
Now the Harriers come into their own. Defence for the fleet and its precious helicopters. Take off 3 a minute, and that's faster than the Americans.
All positions AWO, believe the aircraft to be low. Low, has not delivered his Exocet yet. Seeking Whisk is still holding himself.
Noise and adrenaline and discipline.
All positions AWO, alarm aircraft 258. That DR track still good.
Men and women side by side.
All positions AWO, single Exocet closing 258, 21 miles.
Anti-flash making them look like monks or druids.
All positions AWO, Exocet now green 1202 miles. Brace, brace, brace. Close your weapon system, keep fighting.
Incantations over the radar screens.
045, reduce 1. Oppositions AWO, stand 2. That's raid complete.
It's like a silken oiled machine, the coordinated killing power of guns and rockets and helicopters and jets. The cool, controlling human intelligence. The sequential triggering of layer after layer of defense. The electronic warning, watching, measuring, identifying. But appearances can be deceptive. Like skillfully patched and mended clothes, this professional patterner conceals some deep and serious flaws. Numbers first. 8 Harriers, coming home simple, unfussy birds to the nest. But those 8 are all that Invincible has, along with its dozen specialized unarmed helicopters. Enough to frighten the enemy? Sharp, pointy little teeth for defending its own airfield and any battle fleet with it. They give quite a nasty nip too when they switch to attack. Say in the Third World, a role much talked of since the Gulf War and the Soviet decline. But on balance, the Invincible complex is 50% too small for the job it is asked to do. Result, since we've only 3 of these mobile airfields and one will always be in dock, they're dangerously close to becoming too precious to use. And the more the focus shifts from big war to small hotspots, the more this will weigh with politicians. Now the hidden flaw. It's self-evident Invincible has very few Harriers, but that's only half of it.
You have to hold all deck moves shortly.
Descent into the underworld, where men work through the night so that machines will fly by day. Harrier is a 35-year-old design and largely unchanged.
How far, though, having to use very old equipment, how much does that add to the workload, the maintenance? Because if it was an old car, they get worse and worse to maintain.
Yes, inevitably older airframes require more maintenance, and the maintenance workload has gone up as the aircraft have aged, and there is a compensating increase in manpower, I think, required within the squadrons to overcome that increased maintenance load.
What we would like, obviously, is an aircraft with a little more endurance than the one that we have at present. We would like an aircraft that is, if I could use the expression, a little more maintainer-friendly, one that is more readily maintained. Conditions for working on aircraft in a ship such as this are never easy, and the more one can build into the design of the ship, the aircraft, then so much the better.
What is the unfriendly part of its maintenance?
The unfriendly part is that whatever, a lot of the equipment that one may wish to check or change may well involve the removal of the engine. The engine obviously is a fundamental part of the entire aircraft, and removal of the engine is both time-consuming and affects every aspect of the engine's systems.
Well, you've got to take a wing off before you can get the engine out, haven't you?
That's correct, yes, you have indeed.
How long does that operation take?
It's very difficult to give a specific answer to that because it depends on the conditions under which one carries out the operation. If one is concentrating purely on that operation to change an engine, if the conditions on board are suitable, and by that I mean you've got the space within the hangar, the weather conditions and other conditions are suitable, then it can be done in a matter of a couple of days.
Now, this is quite serious, isn't it? Because let us say that you were in a war, even a little one, you could have your Harriers out of operation for a couple of days while you're changing engines, and you've only 8 of them.
We would obviously like more Harriers when carrying out a specific operation to which you refer. I can only say that we have never been embarrassed to date with the length of time that it takes to maintain an aircraft with regard to maintaining sufficient aircraft airborne to carry out any task that we have.
In its 35 years, attempts to develop the Harrier have been made and cancelled, made and cancelled, made and cancelled. Now, at long last, the Navy is getting an updated Mark II. But the updates are all to the radar, the rockets, the radio. More of the same, they say. The same idiosyncratic, hard-to-maintain airframe, same engine, same problems.
Fundamentally, it's an aircraft which is going to be simply a development of the one that we have on board. The main advantages are a longer-ranged weapon, which will enhance our ability against fighter escorts that may be with a reconnaissance aircraft or with a missile-carrying aircraft. The avionics within the aircraft are greatly improved, which will make life for the pilot a great deal easier in the aircraft. The communications will improve, and probably one of the most important aspects is the radar. And the radar will improve its all-round ability in all weathers and over land and so on.
Now, the Harrier really is an old aircraft, and I can remember it languishing in the 60s. Nobody would buy it because it wasn't supersonic, it didn't have the range, it didn't carry enough weapons. You remember what was said about it?
Yes, they're all true. It isn't supersonic, it doesn't have spectacular range and endurance performance, nor any great lifting capability. I think it's a shame that it wasn't developed more, and more money wasn't spent on it, because I feel sure that it could have been sold in much greater numbers had its potential been fully realised.
The way missiles have developed, does it matter whether an aircraft's supersonic or not?
It matters. It's a matter of priorities and how you balance the requirements that you need. I don't believe that it's very important to be supersonic. It would be a nice to have, but there are other things that I would like to get right before that, given a finite sum of money.
Like what?
The weapon system, obviously, which we're working on with the FRS-2, and we ought to be looking at more range and endurance performance out of our aeroplane, better cockpits, long-range VID systems, and somewhere
VID of what?
Visual identification of as the radars become more capable and as the missiles get longer and longer legs, the requirement to visually identify a target at long range is difficult, and as the range of missiles increases, it becomes more of a handicap not to be able to do that. So, for example, the F-14 has got a super system where it can visually identify targets at long range, and it's therefore able to engage them without getting close enough to be shot down itself. If the rules of engagement insist that you do have to complete a VID before you shoot them, then clearly it's useful to have such a system. Things like that, I think, are of more importance than the ability for supersonic dash. However, if it's there, we'll certainly have it. Of course, it's useful.
It was homecoming after 3 long months, and the Navy did what it rarely does these days: splice the main brace. The Navy maintains traditions, and one of them is the ability to present an immaculate front, to use skill, professionalism, and some low cunning to conceal defects in its equipment not visible to the naked eye, to dazzle with sheer virtuosity when they are. I would argue it is self-defeating. It makes us complacent, smug, nosier about what boys and girls can or can't do on board than about what Harriers and helicopters can or can't do. I would argue the Navy behaves at times like its own worst enemy.
Done. All ready to go.
A stylish, sentimental homecoming, when sailors dress up as Jack Tars, and England gets what it has grown into the habit of expecting: superbly professional men putting their lives on the line in order to cover up, to put a good face on the tools they have to use. Invincible towering into port is a sight to lift the heart, but it is merely a floating airfield, and it is the aircraft that count. And I would indict the Navy for not successfully bringing it home, that elements of those machines are in some cases 35 years old, and in others lashed up from bits of North Sea oil pipe. I've been a reporter enough years to know how the services lobby, how they're always asking for more, more, more. But this, which I have seen with my own eyes, is deeply disquieting.
May be redundant as far as Britain is concerned. We thought so in the 60s. We thought so again briefly in the early 80s. But they have been explicitly excluded from this latest round of peace dividend defense cuts. So we must judge them necessary. In which case, the least that we can do for the people who serve on them is to see that they have aircraft that are worth carrying.